The rain had not stopped in 3 days. It fell in thin, endless threads, hissing against the cracked stained glass of St. Baruch's chapel, a church so old that even the angels in the murals looked tired of praying. Father Elias Marrow moved through the dark hall with a candle trembling in his hand. The flame stretched shadows across the pews like long, skeletal fingers. Dust hung in the air, heavy as ash. He had served here for 27 years. He thought he had seen everything: grief, confession, madness, until the wall behind the altar began to bleed. It started as a dampness. A slow red seeped through the stone. When Elias scraped away the plaster, he found an ancient compartment bricked shut, and within it, wrapped in mold and string, a book of hymns. The leather cover was cracked and slick with time. The words inside were written in a language older than scripture, the ink brown with age or blood. The first page bore a single title, hand-carved and trembling: Psalm 13, the song of those who died before the light. He ran his thumb over the letters. For a moment he thought he felt them move. Outside, thunder rolled like something enormous turning in its sleep. Inside, a faint humming echoed through the chapel, a sound that wasn't his. Elias froze. It was a melody, low and distant, like a choir buried deep beneath the floor. The candle flickered wildly as if gasping for air. He shut the book. The humming stopped. He opened it again. The same sound returned, only louder. And though there were no words he recognized, his lips began to move on their own, tracing each line in a whisper that wasn't quite his voice. And in the silence before dawn, the dead shall sing again. The candle went out. And in that pitch-black chapel, Father Elias heard a second voice sing with him, one that came from directly behind the altar. When the candle finally sputtered back to life, Father Elias was no longer alone. The air in St. Baruch's chapel had changed, thick and cold like the lungs of a tomb. Dust swirled in slow, deliberate spirals, moving as if stirred by unseen breaths. The altar, once clean and gray, was now blackened as though it had been scorched centuries ago. The old priest's hands trembled. The hymn book lay open on the floor, pages fluttering though there was no wind. From beneath the altar came the faint, hollow echo of singing. Not music, not worship, something older, hungrier. He lowered himself slowly, pressing his ear to the ground. The sound was clearer now, a chorus of hundreds, all whispering the same single word between their verses. A word that made his blood run cold. A name. Amdur. Elias stumbled back, clutching the crucifix on his chest. His breath came in ragged bursts, his lungs refusing to obey him. The hymn book turned a page by itself. Another verse revealed, the ink shifting, bleeding new words across the paper. When dust remembers its breath, the forgotten will awaken, and the choir shall rise to swallow the faithful. As the words formed, the walls began to breathe. Fine powder drifted from the ceiling like ash. The statues of saints lining the chapel began to hum, low, vibrating moans leaking from their stone mouths. One cracked down the middle. A soft voice spilled out, hoarse and mournful. Then another, and another. Soon the entire chapel was singing. Elias clamped his hands over his ears, but it was inside him now, the melody worming through his bones, turning the rhythm of his heartbeat into something alien. The candlelight bent backward, shadows twisting upward like hands reaching for the ceiling. And from beneath the altar, the floor began to bulge as if something beneath the stone wanted to rise. The hymn book snapped shut. And from the silence that followed came a whisper that did not echo, because it was not sound. It was memory. The choir remembers you, Elias Marrow. You sang once before the light. When dawn came, it brought no light, only fog. Thick, gray mist coiled around the chapel, swallowing the village below. Not even the birds dared to sing. Father Elias hadn't slept. His eyes were hollow, bloodshot from candlelight and fear. The hymn book sat sealed inside a drawer, wrapped in rosary beads that pulsed faintly with warmth, as if resisting something unseen. He thought the nightmare had ended, until the bell began to ring. It started low, a single metallic groan from the chapel tower. Then again, and again. A steady tolling rhythm, slow and deliberate, though no one had touched the rope in decades. The villagers gathered outside, their faces pale and drawn. The tower door creaked open by itself, its hinges screaming. Elias stepped into the cold, clutching his crucifix like a weapon. "Father," one of the villagers whispered, eyes darting up the tower. "There's no one up there." But the bell kept ringing. With each toll the fog pulsed, like breath. And in the echo of each chime, whispers rippled through the air, faint voices tangled in the sound. Come back, the choir waits. Elias forced himself toward the tower. The air grew heavier the closer he got. The fog thickened around his legs like wet cloth, dragging him down. He reached the wooden stairs. They groaned under his weight as he climbed, the bell sound growing sharper, no longer ringing but screaming. Halfway up he found the first smear of blood. Then another. And then, a handprint. Small, childlike, dried into the wall. He whispered a prayer. The bell tolled again, and this time he felt it inside his chest, vibrating his ribs like a heartbeat. When he reached the top, the rope was still. The bell swayed on its own. And when he looked beneath it, he saw something impossible, a mouth carved into the bronze, wide and grinning. The clapper was gone. In its place hung a tongue of dried flesh. Each swing made it whisper. Each whisper made the fog outside stir and moan like the sea. You heard our hymn, now hear the call. The air split with the next toll. The villagers below began to scream. And as Elias turned toward the window, he saw shadows rising from the fog, hundreds of them walking with no faces, drawn toward the sound of the bell that never stopped. When Father Elias awoke, he was lying at the foot of the altar. The world was quiet again, or perhaps empty. The bell had finally stopped ringing, though the echo still trembled faintly in his skull. He looked around. The chapel was unrecognizable. The walls wept with streaks of black condensation, as if the stone itself were sweating blood. Candles had melted into formless shapes, their wax crawling like pale worms. The air smelled of iron and rot. He stumbled to his feet. His cassock was torn, his hands bruised. He didn't remember falling from the tower, but somehow he was alive. Alive, yet different. Then he heard it, a faint rustle behind the pulpit. Something turning pages. He froze. There was no one else there. Yet the sound persisted, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. He turned toward the altar. The old hymn book, the one sealed and wrapped in rosary beads, now lay open. The beads were shattered. And from the open pages, blood seeped between the lines like ink spilled from a wound. Elias approached with trembling hands. The script, once Latin verses of sacred songs, had changed. The words shifted on their own, forming jagged black symbols that seemed to crawl across the parchment. He felt his vision blur as whispers filled his ears. Faint, urgent, calling. Read it. Read what you swore to hide. Let the choir remember your name. He tried to shut the book. The pages resisted. They were warm, alive. Blood soaked into his fingertips, and when he pulled away, the words followed. Letters burned into his skin, glowing faintly like embers. Panicked, he tore a page from the book. It screamed. The sound wasn't human, a chorus of distorted voices as if 1,000 throats were crying from beneath the parchment. The chapel lights flickered. The crucifix above the altar tilted slightly, its nails loosening, as if something was pushing from behind the wall. Elias fell back, clutching the torn page. Blood dripped from its edges, spreading into the floorboards, tracing a circle around the altar. Then the hymn began. Soft at first, a melody he remembered from childhood, sung by choirs long dead. But as the bleeding circle closed, the sound grew stronger, layered, inhuman. Shadows moved across the walls, forming silhouettes of people kneeling, praying, their mouths opening and closing in unison. No faces. No eyes. Only darkness where their heads should be. The altar split open with a cracking sound, like ribs breaking. From within, something moved, slow, deliberate, dragging itself upward. It wasn't flesh. It wasn't spirit. It was the words themselves, bleeding from the pages, weaving into a form that resembled a man but shimmered with script, each line of text alive and writhing. You wrote it, the figure rasped, its voice echoing through every corner of the church. You kept it caged in ink, and ink always runs. Father Elias stumbled backward. The crucifix crashed to the ground behind him. The hymn swelled until his ears bled. He tried to run. The doors sealed shut with a sound like breathing. Blood poured freely from the open book now, flooding the floor, climbing his ankles like vines. The faces in the shadows were laughing, singing, chanting in an ancient tongue. The 13th verse, the unholy hymn, the name of the forgotten God. He screamed as the script from his hands spread across his arms, his neck, his face, burning symbols carving themselves into his flesh. The world dimmed around him. And as he fell to his knees, the figure reached forward, pressing its bleeding hand onto his chest. "Now you will write it for us." And in that moment the book, the bleeding manuscript, closed itself. The pages stopped screaming. Only silence remained. When the villagers found the chapel the next morning, the altar was gone. The walls were covered in writing, hundreds of verses scrawled in blood, all signed with the same trembling name, Elias. And at the center of the floor, resting open and dry, was the hymn book, its title newly written. The 13th hymn, bound in flesh, sung in blood. The sun never rose over St. Hallows Hill that morning. The village remained trapped in a twilight that never ended, a dull gray haze pressing down like a shroud. The chapel doors were sealed with something darker than wood, and the air outside stank of burnt incense and rusted iron. They said Father Elias was gone. But when the bell rang again, hollow and deep, the people knew he was not alone anymore. Inside the chapel, the candles lit themselves. Their flames burned black. A procession of figures entered through the cracks in the air, tall, robed silhouettes stitched together from shadow and smoke. They moved in rhythm, their steps soundless, their faces veiled in the kind of darkness that bends light. Each one carried something in its hands, relics of bone, chalices filled with moving ink, crowns made from human teeth. At the altar stood the book, no longer bleeding, no longer screaming, but pulsing, as though a heart beat beneath its cover. The largest of the shadowed figures approached it and spoke in a voice that sounded like wine through a tomb. "The hymn is written. The scribe is chosen. The feast begins." 100 whispers answered from the darkness. "Amen." From beneath the floorboards came the scraping of nails, hands, hundreds of them, clawing upward, trying to escape the earth. The ground cracked open, revealing faces pressed into the stone, the lost choir, their mouths sewn shut but still moving. They were not singing anymore. They were hungry. Father Elias stood among them, or what was left of him. His skin had become parchment, his veins black lines of text that shimmered faintly with unholy light. His eyes were gone, replaced by hollow sockets that glowed faintly red. He raised the hymn book with both hands. The symbols across his flesh began to move again, forming circles, eyes, mouths. When he opened the book, darkness spilled out like liquid. It crawled along the pews, up the walls, and across the ceiling, swallowing everything it touched. Then came the feast. The shadowed figures opened their mouths, long, splitting their faces from ear to ear, and the air filled with a low droning sound that made the candles shiver. The darkness from the book poured into them, and with each gulp they grew more solid, more real. Elias fell to his knees, screaming words no human tongue could form. The pages turned on their own, each one revealing a scene. A child crying in a crib of bones. A church burning beneath a sky of eyes. A God drowning in his own worshippers. The choir below began to hum, their throats tearing open as black light poured from their mouths. Eat and be whole. Drink and remember. For the 13th mouth must never close. The shadows bent over the pit and began to feed. They tore pieces from the stone like flesh. They drank from the air as if it were blood. The hymn book fluttered wildly, pages tearing themselves free and circling like dying birds. Outside, the villagers watched the chapel windows glow red, then black. Those who ran heard the bell toll one final time, 13 slow, uneven strikes. And when the sound stopped, so did the village. Every lamp flickered out. Every voice went silent. And in the distance, above the hill, something vast exhaled. For in the silence that followed, if you pressed your ear to the ground, you could still hear it, faint, wet, and endless. The sound of chewing. They thought the Feast of Shadows had ended with the last toll of the bell. But the air still trembled. The walls still bled. And beneath the chapel, something breathed. The survivors of St. Hallows Hill gathered outside the ruins, clutching lamps that burned low, refusing to die even as the night pressed closer. The silence was too complete, the kind that made even thoughts echo. Then someone whispered, "Do you hear it?" At first there was nothing. Then, a hum. Well, human. But not one voice. Well, 12 voices chanting in harmony, coming from deep within the earth. Each one spoke a verse in a different tongue, Latin, Aramaic, something older, something that didn't belong to this world. They rose and fell like waves. And between them was a gap, an empty pause, where a 13th voice should have been. Father Elias had written of it once, before he vanished into the feast. There are 13 mouths that sing to the dark. When the last voice joins the hymn, the world will end in harmony. As the chanting grew louder, the lamps began to shatter, one by one. The villagers screamed as the air filled with whispers. Each whisper was their own voice, repeating their fears back to them. From beneath the chapel came a deep rumble, like the turning of a colossal wheel. The ground split. Stone and soil gave way, revealing the pit, the hollow where the shadows had once feasted. But now there was light, not holy, not divine, a thick, pulsing red that painted the world in blood. The 12 figures stood in a circle, robed in tattered flesh and shadow. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, yet no sound came out. Instead, the voice came from the air around them, from within the listeners. Every survivor clutched their heads, bleeding from their ears as their throats began to vibrate. They screamed, but the scream wasn't theirs. It belonged to something else. The 13th voice was awakening. It spoke without words, a vibration that crawled into every bone, every thought. And in that sound they saw visions, cathedrals made of ribs, oceans boiling with eyes, cities kneeling before a sun that bled from its center. One by one the 12 fell silent, their mouths sealed shut with melted wax. Then from the center of the circle, a shadow rose. It had no face, only the echo of one, a deep void where features should be. And when it opened its mouth, the sound that came out shattered the last of the lamps, split the chapel stones, and sent the stars above flickering like dying embers. The villagers fell to their knees. Some prayed. Some laughed. Some tore at their skin to drown out the sound that wasn't sound at all. It was meaning too heavy to bear. The 13th voice had joined the hymn. The world had begun to hum an answer. Somewhere in the dark, a bell began to toll again, not from the chapel but from the sky itself. And when the echo reached the horizon, the stars blinked out one by one, devoured by the sound. Then the whisper came, not around them but inside them. Now the choir is complete. And every shadow turned to look at the last living soul on St. Hallows Hill. Because the 13th voice had chosen a vessel. And it was you. The bell stopped ringing at midnight. The sound didn't fade, it ended as if cut apart by something sharper than silence. And when it did, the world felt thinner. Smoke rose from the ruins of St. Hallows Hill, curling toward a moon that no longer looked real. Those who survived the 13th voice wandered the forest like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their lips murmuring broken fragments of hymns that belonged to no church. At the heart of the ruins stood the chapel, or what was left of it. Its walls had melted into a black, glass-like stone, twisted into spires that reached for the heavens as though to drag them down. The altar had changed too. No longer stone, but bone. A shape of ribs, a throne carved from the skeleton of something that had once been alive. That was where the Mass began. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt incense and rotting earth. Candles floated in the air, their flames burning black, casting no light. Shadows moved across the pews, not cast by anything but moving on their own, flickering in slow rhythm like breathing. From the dark, the choir of 12 emerged once more. Their robes fused to their skin, their faces covered in wax and their mouths sealed, yet the hymn still came. It vibrated through the walls, through the earth, through the bones of anyone who dared to listen. And then came the 13th voice. Not as sound, not as presence, as command. Bring the flesh. The ground split and hands, pale, skeletal, clawed, reached from below carrying the last of the living. The chosen vessel. Eyes wide, body trembling, bleeding words that weren't his own. Every movement he made was in rhythm with the choir, his veins glowing faintly red beneath his skin. They brought him to the bone altar. Above him the air swirled, dark clouds twisting into a spiral, forming a shape, something vast, ancient, faceless. It didn't descend. It looked. And the choir fell to their knees. The 13th voice began to speak through the vessel, the words crawling out like maggots through broken lips. In the beginning there was hunger. And hunger made us gods. The hymn that followed was not music, it was screaming tuned into rhythm. Every verse peeled the world further open. Every word bled black rain from the sky. The villagers who fled into the woods heard the chant echo for miles. Some ran. Some prayed. Some sang along before their throats burst open. The Black Mass was not a ceremony. It was transformation. The altar pulsed once, and the vessel's chest opened without touch, ribs unfolding like wings. From within light spilled out, red, liquid, and alive. It spread across the floor, crawling like veins, fusing the choir into a single being. They became one shape, one voice, one God. and as dawn tried to break through the clouds, it failed. The sun rose, but it was black, a bleeding sphere surrounded by whispering shadows. From the ruins, the hymn carried one last phrase, whispered in every ear across the valley. The Mass is complete. The world begins anew, in darkness. The wind over St. Hallow's Hill carried no sound, only ash. The trees no longer stood, they leaned, brittle and blackened, whispering as they fell into the soil. The air itself shimmered like dying embers, every breath dry, metallic, and sharp. The Black Mass had ended, but its song still lingered, quiet, patient, like a prayer whispered in a grave. From the ruins something moved. Not a man, not a shadow, something between. Its skin was gray with soot, and its veins glowed faintly beneath the surface like cracks in cooling stone. Every step it took left behind a perfect handprint of ash. This was the choir reborn. 13 voices now living in one body. Their hymn was no longer sung, it breathed. Ashes remember. Flesh forgets. The voice echoed through the valley, carried by the smoke. Those who heard it felt warmth first, a comforting hum beneath the ribs, until the warmth began to burn. Their skin blistered, their eyes wept blood, and from their mouths came a single trembling chant. We are dust returning to dust. Villages miles away saw the horizon darken. The clouds above twisted into a spiral, raining black flakes that hissed as they touched the ground. Every living thing they fell upon turned pale and brittle, as if made of paper, their edges curling into flame without fire. By dawn, the land had become an ocean of ash and silence. Only the ruins of the cathedral remained, its bell still intact though melted half into the altar. From its center came faint singing, childlike, pure and wrong. A traveler passing through the valley days later found carvings on the scorched stones. Each line formed a psalm written not in ink, but in what looked like bone dust. Here ends the choir. Here begins the flame. Here lies the God that forgot its name. The traveler left before nightfall. Behind him, the ashes stirred as if breathing. Something beneath them whispered his name. He didn't turn around. But as he walked, a single gray flake landed on his hand, warm, soft, almost alive. It melted into his skin, leaving a faint, glowing mark that pulsed with every heartbeat. And as he disappeared into the distance, a new verse began to form within him. A whisper beneath his breath. We are the hymn. We are the fire. We are the psalm of ashes. The valley was gone. No trees, no wind, no sound, only the still breath of ash stretching endlessly beneath a colorless sky. The world had gone gray, as if every hue had been drained and left to die. At the center of it all stood the traveler, or what was left of him. He knelt before the half-melted altar of the ruined cathedral, his eyes hollow and unblinking. The mark on his hand had spread, crawling across his veins like cracks in burnt glass. It pulsed in rhythm with the silence, as if the silence itself had a heartbeat. Behind him, the bell, that twisted remnant of gold and bone, began to tremble. It did not ring. It spoke. The hymn is not done. Flesh must finish what ash began. The traveler's mouth moved without will, reciting words that had no meaning in any human tongue. Each syllable rippled through the air like waves beneath the skin of reality. The ground split. From the cracks, black hands reached upward, thousands of them made of smoke and bone dust. They clawed at the lightless sky, weaving together into a shape vast and horrible. The forgotten God was no longer buried. Was remembered. Its form was not flesh but memory, living prayer stitched from centuries of fear and devotion. It towered above the cathedral ruins, a crown of writhing faces and 13 mouths glowing like open wounds. From each mouth came a different sound. Laughter, weeping, chanting, whispering, screaming, all merging into one dreadful harmony. The traveler raised his hands and the ash obeyed. Every particle in the valley lifted into the air, swirling into a storm. The land itself dissolved. Villages vanished. Ocean stilled. The sky blackened until it was nothing but the reflection of the god's open maw. Sing, mortal, the god murmured from everywhere and nowhere. Sing the last verse. And he did. He sang until his lungs turned to dust, until his bones cracked and burned, until his eyes melted into his cheeks. But his voice, did not stop. It lingered, echoing long after his body had vanished, repeating endlessly through the ruins. Ash to him. Him to flame. Flame to God. We are the 13th mouth. We are the name. When silence finally returned, the god began to sink. Slowly. Peacefully. back beneath the veil of the earth. All that remained was the bell, hanging weightless in the air, glowing faintly with each word whispered by the wind. At the world's edge, where no sun rises and no sea moves, a single sound can still be heard by those who listen closely enough. A faint, humming voice beneath the static of sleep, singing the last verse of creation itself. There was light, and then there was song.